This is the TEL Morro Castle as she set sail on a record-breaking maiden cruise from New York to Havana. The date was August 23rd, 1930. This beautiful ship, along with her sister ship, the TEL Oriente, was designed by Theodore Ferris, one of America's foremost naval architects of that day. Her overall length was 508 feet, beam 70 feet, and she drew 27 feet. She bunkered enough fuel to give her a range over 6,000 nautical miles. This was a requirement set by the United States government, since both the Morro Castle and the Oriente had to meet specifications for troop carrier transports in case of a war. She carried 12 lifeboats and 12 balsa floats with a total capacity of 1,020 people. She was designed to carry 530 passengers and a crew of 220. She was equipped with the latest state-of-the-art fire detection equipment and fire suppression devices. She was built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company and was launched on March 5th in 1930. On her maiden voyage, she was billed as the safest ship afloat. This is an aerial view of the TEL Morro Castle taken on 9 September 1934. She lays aground on the beach at Asbury Park, New Jersey. A fire-gutted hulk, destroyed by a catastrophe which took 134 lives, 96 of them passengers, 38 of them crew. And now in 1999, 65 years later, no one really knows what caused the fire and why it spread so rapidly. Throughout the years, millions of words have been written in newspapers, magazines, and books, and many solutions proposed. 3 books, one written by Thomas Gallagher called Fire at Sea, was published in 1959. One by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz called Shipwreck was published in 1972. One by Hal Burton called The Morro Castle, Tragedy at Sea was published in 1973. And one presently in the writing stage by Bob McDonnell and Fred Rasmussen all point the finger at George Rogers, the chief radio operator, as the villain who torched the ship. But one thing stands out. Rogers was never a suspect until he broke into the news years later. Following the Morro Castle fire, Rogers was hailed as a hero. He had sent out the SOS, stuck to the radio until flames drove him from the radio shack, and was credited with getting the badly needed help from other ships. After a short stint telling his story on the stages of the Keith vaudeville circuit, he was employed by the Bayonne Police Department to head up their radio section. Bayonne was one of the first departments to have radios in police cars, and Rogers was an expert in that field. He had a boss, Lieutenant Doyle, who had a hobby of raising tropical fish. Rogers, and what he told Doyle was a gesture of friendship, built a, quote, fishbowl heater, close quote, for Lieutenant Doyle. He told Doyle that the heater was on the workbench and suggested that Royal go in, plug it in, and try it out. Then Rogers quietly left the area. But it wasn't a fishbowl heater, it was a bomb, which fortunately did not kill Lieutenant Doyle as intended, but really busted him up. For this crime, Rogers was sent to prison for attempted murder. He was sentenced to 12 to 20 years, but let out on parole in 1942, so he could serve as a radio operator during the war. After that, he returned to Bayonne and opened a radio shop. He again broke into the news in 1953 when he murdered two elderly people, brother and sister, named Hummel. For this crime, he was sentenced to life in prison, and he died in New Jersey State Prison in 1958. All the authors came to the same conclusion, that Rogers torched the ship. But this has never been proven. Nothing has been developed that definitely says this was true. And Rogers died without ever admitting anything. To this day, 65 years later, the Morro Castle disaster is still clouded in mystery. Picture this. This beautiful ship is plowing north through a heavy fog. The foghorn is sounding every few minutes. This is before the days of radar. Then word comes that the captain, Robert Wilmot, is dead. The purser, the chief steward, cruise director, finally decide, with the approval of the chief officer, to let the passengers know and to cancel the normal last night party. A pall settles over the entire ship. Oh, there were a few parties going on in the passenger lounge, but for the most part, most of the passengers kept things very quiet. Then about 2:45 in the morning of September the 8th, 1934, in a 52 knot gale, a fire is discovered in the writing room locker on B deck. It quickly goes out of control. Some lifeboats are launched, containing mostly crew members and very few passengers. Questions are still being asked. How did the fire start? Why did it spread so rapidly? What caused the captain's death? And why did lifeboats come ashore with only a few crew members? Pardon me, with only a few passengers and a lot of crew members. What a story for news-hungry reporters. What a story for authors who produce books on the tragedy. What a story for radio commentators, writers, of articles and periodicals. Many leaped at the chance to get their version into print, some with little regard for accuracy. Since I am one of the few survivors, Captain Jeffrey Monroe, former director of the Maritime Industry Museum, State of New York Maritime College, has asked me to make a tape to record my experiences on board the ship, to express my opinions relative to what terrible event took place on the night of September 7th and 8th of September 1934. Before proceeding, I would like to clarify 2 points. A, many articles, particularly headlines, refer to the Morro Castle as the SS Morro Castle, the steamship Morro Castle. Actually, she was a state-of-the-art vessel, the latest innovation in the propulsion system. She was a twin-screw ship, propellers turned by electric motors, which gave much better control. The electricity came from turbines, which were driven by steam produced in oil-driven, say, oil-burning furnaces. Thus the name Turbine Electric Liner, TEL, is the correct designation. B, there is confusion about the company name. Many articles refer to the Ward Line. Others talk about the Agwai lines. To clear this up, I must tell you that the Ward Line was the original name and continued to be the popular name through all the years. Actually, the name was officially changed to New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company in 1881. Later on, in 1908, the company was taken over by the Agwai lines, the Atlantic, Gulf, and West Indies lines. The Agwai lines also owned the New York and Puerto Rico line, Clyde Mallory line, among others. So actually, the Ward Line name is the popular name. In fact, the ship continued to carry the Ward Line smokestack markings, 2 white stripes around black stacks, and continued to use the Ward Line logo. His name is Torreson, Thomas S. Torreson, Jr. I was serving as third assistant purser on the TEL Morro Castle when she was destroyed by fire in 1934. My father was the Marine Superintendent of the New York and Cuba Mail Steamship Company, popularly known as the Ward Line, which operated the ship. To avoid redundancy as much as possible, this tape will continue in a question and answer format, with an interviewer asking those questions most put to me in previous interviews, and I will attempt to answer them.
Torreson, can you tell us how old you were when you first served on the Morro Castle, and explain a little bit about your family's long-standing connection with the Ward Line?
Well, actually, I was 17, just going on 18, when I was serving as third assistant purser on the ship. I must say my family did have a long-standing relationship with the Ward Line. My grandfather, Tobias Torreson, was a Norwegian sea captain. His family, wife Theodora, and 5 children resided in Mandel, Norway. This is just a small town on the southernmost tip of Norway. To better the finances of his family, Tobias came to the United States, leaving his family behind. He went to work for the Ward Line and also became an American citizen, which under the laws of the day made his family, whole family, citizens of the United States. When things were set up, he brought his family over and settled them in the Borough Hall section of Brooklyn. They were only there a few months when Tobias, as captain of a ship called the City of Washington, was lost at sea. The story goes, he was washed overboard when he went out to try and correct a bad situation. The cargo had broken loose, deck cargo had broken loose, and a very strong gale. Fortunately, he wasn't missed for a number of hours and could not be rescued. This left his wife and 5 children without a father and without really any financial support. In those days, 1897, there was little insurance and no such thing as compensation. The president of the line, in order to help, gave my father, age 14, a job as an office boy. He worked up from that position to where he became the Marine Superintendent. Actually, he put 52 years with that company. As time went on, his brother Al also joined the company and then ended up as chief engineer of the SS Orizaba. His older sister, Elise, married George Dahl, who became the chief engineer of the SS Siboney. His younger sister, Emily, married Herbert Johnson, a line captain with the company. And if this wasn't enough connection, my father married Winifred McNamara, secretary to the president of the company.
How did you happen to be serving on the Morro Castle when it was destroyed?
Well, it's kind of a long story and a series of coincidences that put me there. In January of 1934, I was a senior at Xavier High School in New York City, like the rest of my classmates, eagerly awaiting graduation in June. Unfortunately, I came down with a bout of pneumonia, which in those days was bad, and was in bed for over a month, thereby missing all the midterm examinations. Our family physician, Dr. William Sweeney, knowing my father's job, suggested that it would be a good idea for my mother to take me on a cruise to Havana. He felt that the sea air and the relaxation would help me recover. Honestly, I think he was really doing this for my mother's benefit, because she was pretty well worn out after nursing me for over 30 days and nights. When I first got on this beautiful ship, I was really impressed. During that voyage, I met 2 young men who were deck cadets, and I got talking with them. It seemed Back in those days, there was no such thing as a maritime academy. If a young man wanted to become a deck officer, he could sign on as a deck cadet. There was a similar program in the engine room where it could be an engine cadet. As a cadet, each learned on-the-job training how to do all of the duties of an ordinary seaman, able-bodied seaman, and so on, under the guidance of one of the licensed officers. They also studied, learned navigation, everything needed for them to pass the examination for a third mate's ticket. I thought this was great. And since I had really no plans for my future, I sort of dreamed of getting such a job. When I came back, they allowed me to take my midterm exams all at one time, and I think some of the instructors gave me a break. Anyhow, I did graduate with my class. At that time, I asked my father if it was possible for me to get a job as a deck cadet. And he laughed and said, "No way. There's over 50 on the waiting list already." Well, the whole family moved to our summer home in Monroe, and I settled down to have another summer of working on the farm, perhaps pumping gas or caddying. My father would commute when he could on the Erie Railroad track, and since I just got my license at age 17, I would drive to town and pick him up at the station. One night, the latter part of June or early July, as my father climbed into the car, he turned to me and said, "Pack your bags. You'll leave for Havana in the morning." Boy, this was quite a surprise. I said, "Dad, you told me it wasn't possible to get a job as a deck cadet." He said, "You're not going as a deck cadet. You're going as a third assistant purser." I hardly knew what that job meant. But you know, the requirements of the job were not that difficult. You had to typewrite, and I used a typewriter all my years of high school. You had to speak Spanish. Well, I had 2 years of high school Spanish. And you had to dance. Well, I was no Fred Astaire, because my sister had taught me the foxtrot and a few other steps. So I guess I basically fit the requirements. What had caused the situation was, as the ship was northbound, and this was on a Friday, the chief purser, Don Roney, had gotten very ill. And it was quite apparent that he had to leave the ship, get to the hospital. The home office was notified by radio, and a decision was made to move the first assistant purser up to purser, second assistant purser up to first assistant, and so on, leaving the third assistant job vacant. Well, at that particular time, there was nobody available to fill that slot. And my father felt this would be an opportunity for me to gain some experience. And of course, at that time, I was only going to serve 1 week, one trip. It turned out to be quite a bit different.
Mother told you you were leaving for Havana the next day. What happened then?
Well, the next morning, I should say I didn't get much sleep that night. The next morning, carrying my suitcase, I walked with my father down about a mile to the Erie Railroad station. And on the way to the city, he told me what I'd have to do. First, I had to stop at the Apple uniform outfitters and get uniforms. Then I had to go to a place called the barge office and get my seaman's passport. Then I had to report aboard the ship to the chief purser, whose name was Bob Tolman. That was hectic. The Erie Railroad ends in Jersey City. We took a ferry across, and my first stop was Apples. I knew how to get there because this is where I got my uniforms from Xavier High School. I was given 2 white uniforms, a cap reading assistant purser, incidentally with the Wardline logo on it, shoulder epaulets, and pair of white shoes and socks. Then I went to got passport pictures made, went to the badge office, got my seaman's passport, and reported on board the ship. Bob Tolman, the chief purser, greeted me warmly, introduced me to the first assistant purser, Russell Duvenage, the second assistant purser, whose name I don't recall, and told me that my duties were clearly outlined in a little book that he had prepared. He had actually set up a little book given chronological order those duties of the purser, first assistant purser, second assistant purser, and the third assistant purser. And all I had to do was follow the book. And as we went through it, he would show me how to do each of the things that were called on. Then we went to lunch. I then had to go to the assistant purser's room and put on my uniform and report to the chief officer, Worms, on the bridge. My first duty after that was to man the foreign embarkation desk, which was located out on the dock. This is where the Spanish-speaking people checked in. Well, I reported to Mr. Worms, and I'll never forget this. He greeted me warmly also, and I made the remark that this was a beautiful boat. The Morro Castle was a beautiful boat. He looked at me very sternly and said, "Mister, we have 12 boats swinging the davits out there. This is a ship, and don't be ever let me catch you calling it a boat again." And believe me, from this day on, I refer to it as a ship. Well, coming back down to the purser's office, I was told what I'd have to do at the foreign embarkation desk, fill out these forms and so on. Here I was going to have to use my high school Spanish. Fortunately for me, the second assistant purser also manned the desk, and he had Spanish as his native language. Further than that, the forms were filled out in both English and Spanish. So it was not difficult at all for me to ask the names, address, and so on required on the form. The next step was to put the cabin numbers on the gifts, the bon voyage gifts that people were sending to the passengers. This was easily too, because I had the list of the people and the cabin numbers, and all I had to do in a black marker pencil was mark the cabin number on the slip and have the bellboys deliver them. Much to my surprise, the first bellboy who arrived on the scene was my cousin, Georgie Dahl. So I guess it's another further extension of family with the line. Now the bellboys are very happy to take on this task because this was a real way of getting tips. After that, I had to man the desk. I also was given charge of the cash drawer, which contained not only money, both American and Cuban money, but stamps, both American and Cuban stamps. And it was my job to take control of the stamp account. Many others of the tasks were explained to me that as the first day tasks as we went along, and they were not difficult. But I'll tell you one thing, the assistant purser's job was nothing like the one shown in that TV series, The Love Boat, where Gopher spends his time running around in shorts and making eyes at the pretty girls. This was a 9 to 9 job where the office was open and then followed on from 9 o'clock at night to maybe midnight each night, doing the required paperwork. It was a full-time job.
Do you have any particular experiences on board prior to the fire that stand out in your memory?
Well, yes. Actually, the purser's job, the assistant purser's job, is similar to that of a hotel clerk. And we have to take care of the passenger's well-being and so on. So if anything happens to a passenger, or they're not happy or whatever, we have to handle it. Actually, I think it was my first or second trip. we were notified that one of the passengers had died up in one of the suites on A deck. And I was sent to supervise the removal of the body and have it taken down to the cold storage locker below decks. Actually, at 17 years of age, I was quite scared of this job, but it was a job I had to do. So getting a couple of seamen to help in the stretcher, we went to the room, put the body on the stretcher, strapped it on actually, but after covering with a sheet. Well, this was around 7:30 in the morning, Sunday morning. And this is the time passengers would be going out to breakfast, down to breakfast on D deck. The deceased cabin was, as I say, on A deck. And I didn't think it would be very wise to carry his body down, from A deck down to D deck, in view of all the passengers, so I elected to use the elevator, the forward elevator. Unfortunately, the elevator is rather small, and the stretcher could not be laid flat on the floor of the elevator. I had to have it stand up on the wall, and I had to stand there and hold the body up against the wall. I always remember the elevator operator, a young fellow named Sidney, standing there with his eyes popping. Sailors couldn't get into the elevator because of the lack of space, so they had to go down the stairwell to meet us down at D deck where the elevator stopped. As we were descending, the sheet fell off the corpse, and I still remember very vividly staring up into that vacant face, and I had nightmares for weeks afterward. That was the only time I experienced a death on board. There was another thing that stood out on my first trip. I had visions of going ashore in Havana, seeing the sights. Third assistant purser had his time off in the day, 8 hours shore leave. I didn't get to enjoy that at all. I was ordered to report to the mate, where I was taught how to launch a lifeboat, and I had to row along other new members of the crew all around Havana Harbor to be sure that any emergency would be able to take care of such a thing. What I got out of this primarily was big blisters on both hands. The third incident I thought was rather cute. As I mentioned before, the purser's job to take care of the passengers. We had a report from the dining room steward that one of the passengers had not come for his meals. He'd missed the meal on sailing night, breakfast that morning, and hadn't shown up for lunch on Sunday. So I was sent down to his cabin to see if there was anything wrong. We didn't suspect seasickness because the water was very calm. When I knocked on the door and explained to the elderly gentleman why I was there, he invited me into his room and said, "Sir," he said, "I'm a farmer. My wife died a number of years ago, and I've saved all my life to have enough money to take this trip." He said, "But I don't have enough money to buy meals on board the ship, and I've caught with me cans of sardines, potted meats, soda crackers, and so on for food. Is that okay?" I said, "Sir, when you pay for your ticket, you pay for all meals. There's no further charge for that. Those meals are yours." And I'll tell you, that man made the meal at the dining room that night. For the rest of the trip, he made up for the missing meals.
What happened the night before the fire and in the early morning hours of September 8th? And what were you doing at that time?
Well, on the night of September the 7th, actually that whole day, we were busily engaged in preparing the necessary papers for arrival in New York. This was to be my last trip. As I said before, a series of coincidences had caused me to stay on the ship not only for more than one trip, but for the remainder of the summer. These are the time of the year when people take vacations and so on. And so it was relatively easy. At one point during that time, I even served as second assistant person, where a man came in as third under me. And then when other ships were made in the company, I was dropped back again to third, with a new second assistant coming aboard. Anyhow, on that last day, we were in a heavy fog off the Virginia Capes, Cape Fear, Cape Hatteras, and so on. And that evening, it was rather weird. We were in the purser's office, hearing the fog whistle blow every few seconds, or I should say every few minutes. This gave a very dismal feeling. And we got a phone call to locate Dr. Van Zyl and get him up to the captain's quarters. Van Zyl at the time was eating dinner in the main dining room. He was located and sent up to the captain's quarters, and very shortly thereafter called the purser's office to inform us that the captain had died, Captain Robert Wilmot. Actually, at that time, the purser was busily engaged in writing radiograms to inform the company what had happened. And at that time, Dr. Van Zyl came to the purser's office, and I had to type out the death certificates. Now, in those days, we had no Xerox machines or anything like that, so I had to use plain carbon paper, and they required 13 copies. So I had to do it a number of times. Incidentally, the doctor at that time stated that the captain had died of a heart attack brought on by acute indigestion. After I finished this, I had to take those papers up to the bridge for the signature of the captain, now acting Captain Worms. I found Worms and Abbott, the chief engineer, in deep conversation. There was a discussion between Worms and Abbott as to who should actually sign the certificates. Since Abbott, with 4 stripes on his sleeve, was senior to Worms, I pointed out to Worms that he was now the captain, and the thing called for the captain's signature. So he went ahead and signed the documents. In the meanwhile, there had been a discussion between the purser, chief steward, and the cruise director, Bob Smith, as to whether or not the passengers should be informed of the captain's death. And the decision, approved by now Captain Worms, was that they should be informed, and the last night out party canceled. So Bob Smith, the cruise director, went to the dining room, so informed the passengers. And of course, this put a real pall over the ship again, and things were very quiet. Though sure there was a few parties being held in the lounge, but most people, out of respect to the captain, kept things quiet. Well, with all the reports that we made, radio messages back and forth, and so on and so forth, we were all very busy in the purser's office. And it wasn't until around midnight that my roommate, Les Harrison, who was second assistant purser, got to go to our quarters. I should mention that the assistant purser's room on the ship, which contained 2 bunks, a wash basin, and a clothes locker, was very small. So it was our practice to occupy. We kept our clothes in the assistant purser's room, but we actually slept in the regular passenger cabin, anyone that was unsold. There was one on D-deck aft, which we used quite often, because although it was a beautiful cabin, its location in the after part of the ship made it not too desirable for passengers. Well, both of us were exhausted, fell asleep very rapidly. The next thing we knew, there was a pounding on the door. Les opened the door and saw one of the electricians, who thought we were passengers, who said, "Please get up, get dressed, put on your life jackets and report on deck. The ship is on fire." Well, then, recognizing that we were a couple of assistant pursers, he said, "Hey, fellas, you better get up there, get dressed, get up there and help calm the passengers." Well, this Les and I both did. We got fully dressed in our uniforms. And since we both had faith in the safety of the ship, I even stopped to comb my hair. Well, we proceeded from D deck, where our quarters were, a cabin, to C deck, and walked forward toward the purser's office, which was on the forward portion of C deck. At that particular point in time, things were fairly quiet, not really much noise, and no really sign of any fire. Arriving at the purser's office, I found Bob Tolman, the purser, and Bob Smith, the cruise director. So I said to the purser, "Bob, is it serious?" And pointing to the stairwell, forward stairwell, he said, "Go up and take a look." Well, I went up toward B deck. I couldn't get there with one mass of flames. So I come back down and said, "Boy, it is serious." And Bob said, "Yes. And Tom, I want you to take the port side on C deck and be sure all the passengers are out of their rooms and move them to the stern. We can't get them to the lifeboats because the fire was on B deck." And he said the same thing to Les Harrison. "You take the starboard side. Be sure everybody is out of the rooms and if they have their life jackets on." This we did. You know, actually, there weren't too many passengers still left in their rooms. I just remember one lady who wanted to get back to her room to get her fur coat. I talked her out of that one. We got all the passengers back to C deck aft. Meanwhile, others were doing the same thing on D deck. We then took the passengers and moved them up to B deck in the vague hope that we might be able to get to the lifeboats, which were in the davits up on A deck. This is impossible. The fire was just sweeping across there. I stood on the starboard side on B deck, looking out over a raging ocean, pouring rain, heavy gale, and saw the first lifeboat to leave the ship. This was number 1 boat, a motorized lifeboat. It was being tossed around mercilessly in those waves. I think they were trying to get around to the stern to get some passengers off. As I learned later, they had trouble with the engine and couldn't make it. But during that time, looking at them out there in that water, I really feared for their safety and felt a lot safer myself on board the ship. Well, as the fire progressed, I think it was Andy Pond, one of the stewards, or somebody, not that I really didn't recognize, ordered that we move the passengers down from B deck, because the fire was starting to sweep across there, to C deck, and ultimately from C deck down to D deck. At this point in time, there was hope that rescue ships and lifeboats would get off the stern and be able to get passengers off that way. I was on C deck on the port side, and at this point in time there was a tremendous amount of smoke. Couldn't see anything. The lights had gone out. I had tried to work a fire hose, That didn't work. There was no pressure. And this was because, as I learned later, people who had been using fire hoses had to abandon them to get away from the fire. And of course the fire hoses were still on, depleting the pressure. At any rate, somebody, I don't know who it was, seeing my white uniform, grabbed me and asked me if I could take care of this young boy. Developed that this youngster, age about 12, was badly burned. I tried to put a life jacket on him, but he wouldn't have it because of the pain. His back was burned. He apparently had been in one of the upper level A-deck suites, and how he got down to C-deck I'll never know. At any rate, he was now in my care. Well, we had to get all the passengers possible down at D-deck because the fire was starting to come out on C-deck. And I got sort of stuck with the job of getting all down, as many as possible, and then closing the door to try and keep the fire from getting down to D-deck too quickly. But soon became apparent that C-deck was becoming unlivable. We were going to have to jump. So I asked the young fellow, his name was Bobby, if he could swim, and he said yes, he could. So I said, what we'll do is we'll climb over the rail. You jump first, and I'll jump right after you. Then you can hang around my neck, and we'll both be on the same life jacket. Well, this we did. Unfortunately, I forgot to hold the life jacket down. In those days, we had the Coast Guard approved life jackets were canvas, and they had big blocks of cork as a flotation device. When I jumped, that life jacket cork popped up, hit me right in the jaw. I had a big welt here on my right jaw. And I guess it knocked me out momentarily. In any event, I had the boy on my back. Well, we were very many hours together in the water. I remember at one point in time, there was a kind of a corpulent fat lady who seemed very calm, floating around in her life jacket. And I asked her if she'd help me with the lad because I was getting very tired and his weight was around my neck was very painful. She said, Tom, not only no, but she said, just let him go, save yourself. Well, I don't know who she was to this day. But as we floated around like this, we talked a little bit. And I tell you one thing, this was a gutsy kid. He didn't complain. But for a while there, I didn't hear a word or sound from him. He wasn't answering anything. So I pulled him around to my front and realized he was dead. Most likely of shock, perhaps hypothermia. A word never known in those days. I think many people died of hypothermia in the water, even though the water was relatively warm. Well, I hung on to his body until an oar came along. And I tied the body over an oar, still hanging on to the oar. And fortunately for me, after an hour or two, a lifeboat from the city of Savannah came alongside and pulled me in. They wouldn't take the young boy's body because they didn't have enough room for the living. And to this day, he remains among the missing.
Some passengers have claimed that the crew did nothing to help them, and in reality left them to fend for themselves. Is that true?
Well, to answer that question, we have to take a look at diagrams of the ship, both the side view and a plate view. Okay, now if you look at the side view of the ship, the top deck up here, that's the navigating deck, bridge, officers' quarters, and the like. Directly below that is A deck. A deck is where the lifeboats were in the davits, 12 of them. Here's where the crew would report to man those boats. Then they were supposed to be lowered to B deck, the promenade deck, where the passengers were aboard. Well, the location of the passengers' lifeboat stations was on the very deck where we had the fire. The fire started in the B deck library and swept the whole length of the deck. That's why the passengers couldn't get to the lifeboats. The few passengers who did get into lifeboats did so by mounting into the boats when the boats were on A deck. Going further down, C deck and D deck and E deck aft where most of the passengers were. This is where most of the passengers had their cabins. Up here at A deck and B deck, there were very few cabins, although these were the deluxe suites. So you have to keep in mind, I should point out this too, that the only place we could move the passengers was aft. They couldn't get up to the lifeboats, up to B deck. They had to go aft. There was no way to go forward. Here there was no way of getting up to the bow. If we'd been able to get the passengers to the bow, they would have been safe up here because the fire never touched the bow. Everybody knows that a ship, even not under power, the weather vane point into the bow, and when it's anchored across the bow will be into the wind, blowing the fire up to the stern. So keep that in mind, that the fire actually cut the passengers off in the boats. And the fire also cut the ship's officers, the mates and so on, from getting down to the passenger area. So effectively the fire split the ship in the middle, confining the passengers to the lower decks and the ship's officers, the deck officers, above. Now, many passengers said they didn't have any help from the crew. Actually, there was two very nice young sisters on board, the Prince sisters, who for years after the disaster sort of made a career out of talking about their experience. And they claimed that they had no help from the crew. Let's take a look at plate view of the ship. Now this is A deck, is where the lifeboats were. B deck is where the fire started. C deck is where the purser's office was. And D deck. Well, these young sisters occupied a cabin on D deck on the starboard side forward. And they always made a point of saying that their cabin number was 313, their lucky number. Now these two young ladies, incidentally, I talked to them at one of the reunions of the Morro Castle survivors up at the Maritime Academy. They stated unequivocally that none of the crew helped them. In their story, they mentioned that they had decided not to go to bed, so they were fully clothed in the cabin when the older sister thought she smelled smoke. She picked up the telephone in the room. Incidentally, we didn't have dial telephones in those days. When you picked up the phone, you were connected with an operator. The operator answered. He told the operator she smelled smoke. And the operator, a crew member, said, "Yes, ma'am, we have a fire on board. get dressed, put on your life jackets, and report to your boat station. Well, here's the first crew member who did help them. They left their cabin on D deck forward, proceeded up the stairway to C deck forward, and saw nobody. The reason? We were all asleep. My roommate, Les Harrison, and I were asleep in our cabin on D deck aft, way aft here. The purser asleep in his cabin up here, and didn't know the ship was on fire. So these two young ladies went from C deck, tried to proceed up to B deck, saw it was impossible because it was a mass of flames. They themselves did the only thing logical. They went aft to on C deck, out here. Later on went up to B deck. But at that point, they thought they had no help from any of the crew members. Yet in further to their story, they tell how Bob Smith, the cruise director, was their hero. He had saved their lives. Why? Because when it came time to jump, he cautioned them not to jump right off the stern, but to one side, lest they get caught in the propellers. I remember Bob Smith real well because one of them had a chance to dance with the handsome cruise director. And these young ladies were very impressed with him. And I must say, Bob was a nice-looking guy. Well, actually, when we were awakened, that's Les Harrison and I, up on D deck aft, and proceeded up to C deck to the purser's office, which was our duty station. There, of course, was Bob Tolman, the purser, and, of course, cruise director Bob Smith, as I said before. Actually, if you'll recall, we were awakened in our room aft, D deck aft, by a crew member who thought we were passengers. And he was proceeding the whole length of that area, getting people out of their cabins, telling them to put on their life jackets and where to go. So he was helping the people. Same thing happened on C deck. Same thing happened everywhere on the ship. But if you were in a particular part of the ship at a particular time, you may not have seen anybody, and you would gather the impression the crew were not helping. Of course, this was furthered by the fact that the crew, that is, many of the crew, were in the lifeboats. Well, how did this happen? Well, actually, if we can go back to the side view of the ship, you'll remember that the lifeboats are up on A deck, swinging in the davits. The engine room crew down here, under the command of the first assistant engineer, Anthony Bohier, remained on duty in the engine room until it was unlivable any longer. They couldn't breathe with the smoke. They, in turn, there was an elevator here, but they couldn't take it because of the fire, had to climb up this steel ladder works, which put them out up on A deck. I should say really up on the navigation deck, back to where the chief engineer's quarters are. They had no place to go except into the lifeboats. They couldn't get below because of the fire, so they got into the lifeboats. Many of them at that time were under the impression that the lifeboats would get around to the stern and take the passengers off here. This proved to be quite impossible, not only because of the heavy waves, but the fact that these lifeboats were equipped with oars, great big sweeps. Later on, the Monarch Bermuda lifeboats were able to maneuver here because they were equipped with a system where small handles being pulled actually turned propellers, just as though human beings in the ship, in the lifeboats, were acting as engines. They were very maneuverable. So it was a combination of factors gave some passengers the impression that the crew did nothing to help them. There were other passengers who were helped by members of the crew, and in turn praised what the crew did. The trouble is, the newspaper articles of the day were using their hook. The crew deserted the ship, so they didn't take the good stories. They really expanded on the bad stories.
You mentioned you were picked up by a lifeboat from the city of Savannah. What happened after that and when you finally got to shore?
Well, in the lifeboat, which was crowded, the crew were having a heck of a time. That is, the crew from the steamship, City of Savannah, having a heck of a time in the waves trying to maneuver the boat. They already decided it was too rough to get back to their ship. They were going to try and get ashore. About this time, a Coast Guard cutter came along, one of the small, I think 40-footers, and threw us a line to tow it. The first line broke. So they came around a second time, got a line on board, started to tow us, and their engine quit. I understand later, because they ran out of fuel. So we're still floundering around out there when a small private cruiser, I guess it was something like a Playmate of the day, around 25 to 32 feet, with, to me, elderly men there because they had white hair on board, pulled around, passed the line beautifully to us. We were tied on, and they towed us into the Manasquan, through the Manasquan Inlet. And I tell you, this was a beautiful job of seamanship. They kept that tow line taut, in spite of the heavy waves. And anybody who's ever made the passage into the Manasquan Inlet knows how rough it could be, even on calm days. On this day, with the gale blowing and the waves pounding, they did a nice job getting us ashore. Anyhow, as we were pulled up to the bulkhead and out of the lifeboat, some gentleman grabbed me, pulled off my uniform jacket, and took a jacket from his own son and put it around me so I could get warm. Of course, my uniform cap had come off when I jumped off the ship. We were then put into an ambulance, and a number of us in the ambulance. And the young driver took off, sirens screaming, and really fast. One of the ladies on board said, "Please, have him slow down. He'll kill us all." Well, he did slow down, but we got to the first aid station at Seagirt. And I have to tell you right here that these people on shore were wonderful. There was a Dr. Albright who worked tirelessly to take care of the seriously injured people. The volunteers, the first aiders, and so on, all worked together. The first thing that happened when I hit this first aid station, some lady handed me a glass full of brownish liquid and told me to drink it. Well, my throat was quite raw, both from the fire and the seawater. I tossed it down, not realizing that it was straight rye whiskey. And boy, when that hit my stomach, I felt it. Anyhow, they then took me into a private room, had me strip off all my clothing, and gave me a set of dungarees and a work shirt, underwear too, of course, but no shoes. So here I was in this outfit. I was not hurt except for a slight burn on my right cheek, scorch in my right eye, and had to wear a black patch for about 2 weeks thereafter. I was sent outside. Well, people were milling around. First thing I know, I was grabbed and hugged by Tony Bahia, first assistant engineer. Incidentally, Tony, we'd known him for many, many years. father had helped him get educated, helped him work his way up to assistant engineer. Shortly thereafter that, my father arrived. He shook my hand. My father was a Norwegian, and not very demonstrative as far as affection is concerned, but a wonderful dad just the same. He shook my hand. He said, "Son, did you do your duty?" I said, "Yes, sir." With that, he took off. He said, "I'll see you later." He was gone. I'm still standing around there when I was again hugged from the rear by an old family friend, Mr. James McDonald. We used to call him Big Jim. I had been sort of a babysitter for his son through the years, and the McDonalds were very good friends of our family. And they had a place down at Avalon, an apartment they had rented for the summer. Well, the first thing Big Jim did was take me to the Essex and Sussex Hotel, where my mother was waiting. And that was quite a reunion. Then he insisted we go in and have some food. Now, of course, it's dinner time. So here I sat in this plush hotel, dressed in this nondescript clothing, barefooted. I felt a little embarrassed, but everybody was very nice. From there, we went to the McDonald's apartment, where my mother, in spite of the fact I had spent many, many hours in the ocean, insisted I take a bath. How they did it, I don't know, but Bob Tolman and Russ Duvenage, his purser, assistant purser, also showed up there. I went to sleep, and the next day, I was driven home by my mother and father, and that was about it.
You've stated that numerous newspaper articles at the time and books and articles published since the fire have contained erroneous information. Can you give examples of what you're referring to, and are there any things that you could clarify at this point?
Well, yes, I'd like to first state that Henry Cabot, the vice president, executive vice president of the New York Cuban Mail, gave an order to all those who were working for the company not to talk to reporters. This was a big mistake because the news is there, and if you don't talk to them, they're going to think something's being hidden. So in some respects, I don't quite blame the reporters for using the hook they did, that the crew deserted the passengers and so on. But I think I've already showed how a lot of the stories stem from passengers who really didn't know what the crew were doing. A lot of the publications carried on the same theme. The implication was that the crew was incompetent, couldn't fight the fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. On board, one of the passengers was a New York fireman. He got a lot of publicity saying how the crew was incompetent and couldn't fight the fire properly. If he had been in charge, I would like to ask this gentleman, this highly qualified New York fireman, what about 1942, when the Normandy was tied up to a dock in New York City, went on fire, caused by a workman's torch. There were no passengers on board to worry about. The weather was perfect. They had 5 fireboats on the scene with the New York Fire Department available. They not only failed to put out the fire, but they sunk the ship. So much for the expert who was so verbal in his statements about the crew of the Morro Castle. I think that most people are aware of the tremendous newspaper coverage that went on for years and is still going on. The Morro Castle was the biggest thing that ever happened to Asbury Park. And every year there's articles about the ship. I'd just like to tell you some of the other things that occurred. As I mentioned before, we had a summer home in Monroe, New York. The local paper in Monroe, New York had a headline story making me out a hero for having saved the life of Bob Smith, the cruise director. Oh, it was a great story. How in the water, Bob Smith, who didn't have a life jacket on, was buoyed up by the first assistant purser, Russ Duvenage, and the third assistant purser, Thomas Torreson. Oh, I was quite a hero. The trouble with the story is, I never saw Bob Smith in the water. But this was an AP release. There was a periodical, and there were many periodicals. This is the Steamboat Bill. A beautiful book, which covered the Oriente and the Morro Castle. I'd just like to quote what the author stated about the fire. Standing out were the true heroes of the disaster, both passengers and crew. 18-year-old assistant purser Thomas S. Torreson, Jr., to whom wardline was a family tradition, cruise director Charles Smith, which should have been Robert Smith, stewardess Lena Schwartz, head waiter Carl Wright, Father Raymond Egan, and many others who selflessly aided others. This is good. He's telling that we did a good job. But I tried to find out, by writing to the publisher, how come I was selected as a hero? I didn't think I did anything heroic. I just did the job I was told to do. I will mention that Father Raymond Egan did a beautiful job too. We were up on D deck. Father Egan was helping calm the people. I went to him and said, Father, you know, I was raised in Catholic schools. I said, Father, wouldn't it be nice if you gave general absolution to everybody? He said, I already did. I said, I wasn't there when you did it. How about giving it to me now? Which he did. Well, Father Egan was great. Bob Smith, I guess that he was deemed a hero because of what he did with the Princesses. Stewardess Lena Schwartz, who incidentally was a wonderful person, she would have been a hero anywhere. She would do her job. She was great. And I have no idea what the head waiter is supposed to have done. But here's a case where we were made out heroes, and I don't know on what basis. Now, there's so many of these stories that just were not, true.
You yourself over the years have written numerous letters to the editor pointing out inconsistencies in newspaper articles written about the Morro Castle. You seem to be on kind of a campaign in this regard. Can you explain why?
Well, yes, as I pointed out before, they still continue to print articles about the Morro Castle. They still hang on to the position that the crew deserted the passengers. They still blame Worms, calling incompetent. They still label Abbott a coward for getting into the first lifeboat. So I take umbrage with this. And many times they have errors. For example, headlines still read, SS Morro Castle sinking. A number of times I've had to point out to them the ship never sank. It burned. It was taken from the Asbury Park area to the up around New York, Grapeson Bay, and later on towed to Baltimore, was broken up to scrap. I like to mention that when the ship came ashore in Asbury Park, as you know from the date, it was right after the Labor Day weekend. And Asbury Park, which had a tremendous summer crowd, was now dying down. And this ship brought people back by the thousands to view the hulk on the beach, bringing many, many extra dollars into the pockets of the merchants. The company tried to move the ship, and they got an injunction. The Chamber of Commerce got an injunction prohibiting movement of the ship. Well, of course, as time went by, sand was built up around the ship, and some hides, raw hides, stored in the hold, number 2 hold, started to rot, and the stench was terrible. Now, the Asbury Park people started to scream to get the ship out of there, and this was finally done. But at any point, I knew Captain Worms, and all the people who knew him never had a bad word against him. Somebody, so many stories got into print that were wrong. For example, that Captain Worms and Chief Abbott were bitter enemies. Not true. Captain Worms didn't like Captain Wilmot. Not true, they were best of friends. But reporters, same reason or others, just picked up and invented things. One thing they did really right was there was actually a fire standpipe on B deck, which is the promenade deck, with a hose attached. It was leaking. And one trip, a female passenger stepped out of the forward lobby and slipped on the water on the deck. Captain Wilmot ordered that fire hose disconnected and the standpipe capped to stop the leak. By the time these reporters were finished with the story, every fire hose on the ship had been disconnected, all standpipes capped, and the fire hoses stored. Now, how stupid can anybody be to print something like that? Actually, the trip before the fatal trip, the whole ship was inspected by the Steamboat Inspection Service. Does anybody in his right mind think that they would have passed the ship with the fire hoses disconnected and stored? Well, that's the kind of stories that were floating around, and still float around. So every time I see one, I correct it.
A lot of the published material since the fire seems to focus in on George Rogers as the guilty party. You knew the man, you worked with the man. What did you think of him at the time, and do you have an opinion today?
Well, I knew George Rogers primarily because I had to eat my meals with George Rogers, the chief radio operator, and Georgia Lagner, the first assistant radio operator. I'd like to clarify one thing, for those who do not know it. Radio operators were not hired by the company, by the steamship company. They were employees of the Radio Corporation of America, who supplied radio operators to the steamship companies under contract. So the company, in effect, really did not have a choice of what operators were assigned to the ship. I knew Rogers and Lagner because we ate all our meals together in the officer's dining room. And Rogers impressed me as a gross individual who really annoyed me for one particular reason. In the evening meal, we would normally be served an appetizer, such as maybe a piece of fish, decorated with a little piece of lime, a wedge of lime or a wedge of lemon. And Rogers would reach over with his fork and spear the lemon off my plate, pop it into his mouth, and grinning, chew and swallow the raw lemon. Incidentally, I'd like to mention his first assistant, Alagna. George Alagna was a person who, when I first got on board, I was warned about. He was thought to be a communist, and in those days, communist was a scary word. And whether he was or not, I don't really know. The only thing I do remember very vaguely about, very much about Alagna was he was a very morose person. And one time, in the officer's dining room, he berated a waiter very loudly, cursing him out because he claimed the waiter's sweat had dropped into his soup. Well, this was chicken soup, and everybody knows little globules of fat float around in chicken soup. But Alagna acted so badly in this occasion that the other people had to tell him to shut up. At any rate, as I pointed out at the beginning, George Rogers has been tabbed as the villain who torched the ship by the writers of books, magazines, and so on. But all of this came about years after the ship was destroyed. He became a suspect, as you want to call it that, only after he tried to kill his boss, Lieutenant Doyle, and actually did kill the Hummels. Let me put it this way. First of all, I do not know that the ship was actually torched by anybody. There are other theories where the fire could have started in forward hold, crept up through the vents which were throughout the ship, smoldered in there for days until it finally broke out. But assuming that the fire was caused by an arsonist, I would have to say, if asked who I thought could have set the fire, I would have to say, like the rest of the office, that George Rogers was the one who probably set it. But I could be wrong, because other people thought it was set by communists and dissident Cubans and so on and so forth. Now, the other question, did Rogers murder the captain? Well, Dr. Van Zyl claimed the captain died of a heart attack brought about by acute indigestion. There's no question of murder. Unfortunately, Van Zyl was lost in the water. He died in the water during the disaster. So we don't have his first word on it. Only, actually, as a matter of fact, my remembrance of what was written in the death certificates. I was on subpoena for a year after the event, mostly questioned about that portion. That is the captain's death and how it happened. There's one thing else I'd like to mention that I didn't mention before. The question has always been, why did the fire spread so rapidly? Again, this is conjecture on my part. If you remember, back in those days, there was no air conditioning, no such thing. In fact, there was no swimming pool on the ship. In the 1930s, you were talking about a beautiful ship, but it was only state-of-the-art. The designer, Ferris, knowing the ship was going to be in tropical waters, had designed a cooling system, i.e. vents, that they were sheet metal vents, went throughout the ship, to bring in cool air. The air was scooped in from the upper decks and through these vents, carried throughout the ship. Well, I think, and many other people think, that once the fire got started, it spread rapidly throughout the ship through these vents. They actually acted like a chimney or a flue, carrying the fire throughout the ship. One thing we know is certain, that through these vents, the engine room rapidly filled with smoke, as did the decks well below where the crew slept. There was one point in time we probably could have gotten the passengers from the stern of the ship down through the main deck section, past the hold and up onto the bow. But we couldn't do it because of the dense smoke. So we come right back to the whole thing. I don't know whether George Rogers torched the ship or not. I do know that the fact that he turned out to be a psychotic murderer gave those who authored books a wonderful suspect for their stories.
What lessons do you think should have been learned from the disaster of the Morro Castle and its aftermath?
Well, I guess there's quite a few of those. I think the primary thing I would say to anybody in charge of a company that's involved in something like this, not prohibit the ship's officers from talking to reporters. This is a grave error. The reporter's job is to get the story. If you refuse to talk to him, he's going to think you're hiding something. So I can't really blame the reporters for the track they took. Vice President Capone made a grave error there. Secondly, if I was designing a ship, of course today we have air conditioning, so there wouldn't be a problem of vents like we had on the Morro Castle. But I would make it easy to access any portion of the ship. For example, we could have saved a lot more passengers if there had been on C deck and B deck, particularly C deck, and D deck, I should say, a way for the passengers to get to the bow. They couldn't. It was a solid thing. And most ships today, I was on the QE2, that's the way it was. You couldn't get to the bow from the stateroom area. There should be access to the bow, because in case of fire, that's the safest place to be. Third, I pointed out how the lifeboats were on davits on A deck. That was the style of the day. The modern vessels, cruise ships, have their lifeboats down lower, amidships. The idea being it'd be more accessible to the mass of passengers who were on the lower decks. This is all well and good, except if that particular deck is the one on fire, it would be able to get the lifeboats anyhow. So there has to be access to the bow. I don't know what else I could say, because there's so many things that happened on the Morro Castle, so many things have been said about it, so many things have been investigated, that I could go on forever practically talking about it. But the truth of the matter is, basically, I hope it never happens again, this type of thing never happens again. The Morro Castle was equipped to carry some 500 passengers. The modern cruise ships up to thousands of passengers. And God help us if we ever have another fire on board one of these cruise ships. The loss of life will be astronomical.